Hey guys, vFanatic here, and today let's discuss vSphere 6.5. So this particular video is going to be based upon the vSphere blog, which was released on the 18th of October by VMware. And I'll be touching about the new features, what's cool, what's not so cool about the upcoming vSphere 6.5 release. So vSphere 6.5, one of the major changes is the push to the VMware VirtualCenter appliance. So essentially what's happening is that you're having all of the bundled services which previously was not there with the virtual appliance. You now have the update manager, file-based backup and recovery, as well as the VirtualCenter high availability, which is baked into the appliance. You also have the vCenter appliance migration tool, which allows you to essentially migrate your VirtualCenter from a Windows box onto the server appliance itself. Now, the talked about features here is actually going to be native high availability, update manager, host management, and backup and restore. Now, with regards to host management itself, we have the HTML5 based client, and this is what it actually looks like. So this was a VMware fling back in the days, and due to the response VMware has had, they've actually gone ahead and built and baked it right into this particular install. Now, with regards to the security aspects, you have VM level disk encryption, you have encrypted vMotion, you have a secure boot model, and you also have audit quality logging. What this actually means, we'll be discussing it in a later slide. And so essentially the three most talked about changes is actually secure data, secure infrastructure, and secure access. So wherein you have VM encryption, you have secure boot, which is your ESX boot encryption. You also have added logging. Now, in terms of the app platform, you have integrated container functionality, which is baked into the release itself. And you can actually enable disable containers, work on containers, just like you would on a particular virtual machine. Now, moving on, let's move on to the host and resource management and operation and see what's new there. Now, under the host and resource management operation, basically you have the host level changes which have come in. And one of the things which has come in is the enhanced vSphere host lifecycle management capabilities, which is baked into the VMware Update Manager. Now, this is now integrated with VCSA, so you don't need a Windows client anymore. And you basically have the host profiles, which has now been incorporated into the update manager. You also have a GUI interface for the auto deploy, which is accessible from the web client itself, and you don't need to actually go and make changes on the command line interfaces anymore. Apart from that, you also have the discovered host, the deployed host, and various other options which are there for the auto deploy, which is actually baked into the GUI itself. Host profiles is now, you can actually do this changes to host profile en masse by using the CSV file. So you don't need to actually do it from the command line anymore. And that makes it easier for us to actually go ahead and manage a ton of hosts. Now, moving on. Some of the major changes that have come in are in terms of resource management. So HA, FT, and DRS all have changes which have come in, which are good changes. And one of the primary features which has come in is proactive HA. Now, proactive HA, what it does is that it will detect hardware conditions of a host, and it will actually allow you to evacuate virtual machine even before a particular hardware issue can cause an outage. So how this works is, you basically have management plugins or hardware plugins which are baked into the VirtualCenter now, and that actually gives you real-time issues regarding fans, memory, and power supplies to talk to the ESX host and then to VirtualCenter, which essentially can now intelligently put the host into something called a quarantine mode, which will actually prevent the issues from causing an outage. So how this works is DRS will attempt to migrate all of the virtual machines which are on a particular affected host. That host will be placed into a quarantine mode, and hopefully that should actually prevent an outage. Another thing which has come in is the orchestrated restart under HA. So essentially, if you have a multi-tiered application, for example, let's say you have got a couple of DBs running which are talking to your app and the web service, and you need the DB servers to be up before the app and the other servers come up. So that can now be done. Now, one of the changes has come in the vSphere HA admission control policies, which have now been simplified. So what that means is the administrator now simply needs to define the number of host failures to tolerate for that particular cluster. Everything else would actually be computed by the cluster itself. So as the hosts are added or removed from the cluster, the percentage would automatically be recalculated. So that takes the pain away from managing hosts and managing the cluster in terms of HA. Now, these are the settings which is there, and it can actually be overridden by default. So the default settings can be overridden, and you can also let it go to the previous state. Now, in terms of FT is now baked into and integrated with DRS, and essentially a good thing has happened. What has happened is that FT now works with DRS. Now, first thing is you can enable multiple NICs for FT logging. And the second thing which has happened are the DRS advanced option, which has actually been configured. Now, VM distribution, you can actually have VMs distributed equally. You can have memory metrics for load balancing, which has now come in. And the other thing which has happened is CPU overcommitment, which will allow you to prevent virtual machines from powering on once you actually have crossed a maximum vCPU is to pCPU ratios in the cluster. So that actually prevents you from powering on additional VMs, which later on can cause latency issues or performance issues on the cluster. And those are the options which are available as checkboxes, which you can actually enable or disable. Now, in terms of network aware DRS, so DRS essentially has about 25 plus parameters, which allows the cluster to intelligently make decisions based upon the capacity of the cluster. And now what has happened is it will also take into account network utilization, and it will actually, the way it does that, it will observe the RX and TX values, and it will prevent VMs to go into a host which is more than 80% utilized in terms of network usage. Now, this is an additional check which has come in. So what that implies is the other parameters would still be there. It's just an additional check which has now been baked into DRS. Now, SIOC and SBBM, you have the vSphere APIs for IO filtering or VAIO, which has come in. And that's going to define different policies with different IO limits and then assign VMs based upon those policies. Content library. So now administrators can actually mount an ISO directly from a content library, and then they can apply a guest OS customization during VM deployment and update existing templates as well. In terms of the developer and automation interfaces, so that has been enhanced, as you can see from the screenshots below. And this is how the new interface actually looks like. Now, one of the major changes that has come in is in terms of CLI. So Power CLI is now 100% module based. So essentially what has happened is you have individual modules which have been baked in, and depending upon the feature sets that you're talking to, those modules are easier to actually manage and update as time goes on. Now you have core modules which actually support vCenter vMotion, And you also have 13 different commandlets which focus on trying to automate the entire life cycle of vSAN. So vSAN command line management is actually there as well. Now ESX CLI has been enhanced, and you have additional storage and vSAN capabilities which are now built in. Apart from that, NVMe devices, iSCSI functionality, etc. has been improved. And you also have NIC-based commands such as queuing, coalescing, and basic FCOE tasks which have now come in. But the major change is actually now the introduction of DCLI, and which has features like tap to complete. So as an example, you can see the screen there. Now with regards to operations management, so VROps, the version which it is now on, is 6.4, and that has additional dashboards and dashboard improvements which have come in. Log Insight has been updated, the interface has changed, and also logging has changed as well, which we'll see later on. Now there are 3 new dashboards in VROps, which is Capacity Overview, Operations Overview, and Troubleshooter VM. So an example of a dashboard is actually given below. So you have the 3 tabs on top, which is actually Operations Overview, Capacity Overview, Troubleshooter VM, and the workload utilization. So the look and feel has changed. You basically have a new interface which you can interact with. Now each of these views now have a new object-oriented kind of a layout. So you have your VMs listed on your left-hand side, and then you have the objects which it is supposed to be, which is supposed to define that particular entity on the right-hand side. So some of the information displayed is any active alerts, key properties, KPI matrix, and related based information which you see on the left-hand side there. Now moving on, let's see what are the new features of vCenter Server 6.5. Now vCenter has had a lot of changes in terms of the vCenter appliance, and VMware is actually pushing the appliance as the way forward, I guess, with this particular release. So you've got a brand new installer which has actually come in, and a lot of additional features which have been baked in. So some of the features which are there are migration, improved appliance management, baked-in update manager, native high availability, and built-in backup and restore for the Virtual Center and the platform configuration manager. Now the vSphere web client has had some changes. You also have a fully supported HTML5 based vSphere client, which has been incorporated from the Fling that was there. In terms of migration, so when I talk of migration, it's essentially migrating from a Windows-based Virtual Center to the Virtual Center Linux-based Virtual Center or the Virtual Center appliance. So you've got the migration tool which is actually built in, and Virtual Center servers 5.5 and 6.0 are supported. And now once you're doing a migration, you have an option of choosing what you need to migrate. So you can either go in for just the configuration events and tasks, or configuration events task plus the performance matrix. The install screen now looks like that. You have options of install, upgrade, migrate, and restore. So that's the option which actually allows you to back up and restore your Virtual Center. Now VMware Update Manager is baked into the vCenter appliance now. So the look and feel of it has changed. So it gives you a dashboard in terms of the entities which are actually there, and the layout is actually simplified. Now in terms of the vCenter high availability, you now have a witness which has actually come in to the picture. So you have the primary and the secondary vCenters, and you actually have the witness which has actually come in. So the active, passive, and witness nodes are cloned from the existing vCenter server, and the failover can occur when an entire node is lost or when certain key services fail. Now, in terms of backup and restore is built into the VirtualCenter appliance, and this particular feature set allows you to back up, and then it allows you to do a restore of the VirtualCenter and the platform services controller appliance directly from the VAMI or the API as well. Now, it also backs up the VUM and the auto deploy running embedded with the appliance, and the protocols which it supports is SCP, HTTPS, FTP, or FTPS. Now, the restore window is the one we saw earlier, wherein it's the same install screen. The last option is the one which you'll go to in case you want to restore an appliance you had backed up earlier. So that's the option you need to go to. Now coming to the web client. So the web client looks something like this. So the layout has changed. By default, you're in the inventory view, and it continues to be based upon the Adobe Flex platform and also requires Adobe Flash to use. So that's a bit of a bummer there. However, what has happened is that the entire interface has been redesigned, simplified, and also performance improvements have actually been baked in. Now, the good thing is that the web client is to be retired eventually, and it will be replaced with the HTML-based client eventually. Now, inventory tree is the default view. Home screen has been reorganized. Manage has been renamed to configure. Related objects have been removed. You have performance improvements, and then you have live refresh for past states, tasks, and events. Now, in terms of the vSphere client itself, this is the look and feel of it. So it's got a brand new design language. And also what it has is that it's actually built on the HTML5 instead of Adobe Flex. So this is much more consistent with the new design language that VMware is moving forward to. Now, the good thing is that the vSphere client is actually built into the VirtualCenter server, and it is enabled by default. So there's no installation or uninstallation or anything else you have to do. It's just there. Now, the web client will be available in the old URL, which is vCenter fqdn/vSphere client, and the vSphere client standalone can actually be accessed by using the fqdn/UI. So another thing which will be there is the vSphere client is going to be updated more frequently, and it's not dependent upon the vCenter server release cycles. So that's a good thing, because you can expect more improvements faster. Now, in terms of the vSphere client, it's more clean, consistent UI, and based upon VMware's new standards, it's based upon HTML5. You don't need to install or manage any additional plugins. It is baked into the vCenter 6.5, and it supports enhanced linked mode as well. Now, moving on, the last bit of it is the enhancements in terms of security. So we'll just quickly go there and check what are the new features. Now, in terms of security, a couple of things have come in. One is the VM encryption, which has actually come into this particular release. So unlike other encryption solutions, here encryption will be done by the hypervisor beneath the actual virtual machine. So as I/O comes out of the virtual disk controller in the VM, it is immediately encrypted by the module in the kernel before being sent to the kernel storage layer. So both the VMX, snapshot, etc. and the VMDK files are encrypted. Now in terms of the plus points, the encryption is actually agnostic, so it's not dependent upon the guest OS. Encryption is managed by a policy regardless of the guest OS. Encryption is not managed from within the VM, so essentially you don't have any kind of silo in terms of the actual VM itself, and it is based upon the KMIP 11 protocol. Now another thing to note is that the VM keys do not persist in vCenter. So VM migration takes care of the hardware enhancements in vCPUs, and it is based upon the AES-NI functionality for encryption. So essentially it's a hardware based encryption which is there, and it is independent of the virtual center. So essentially the virtual center doesn't actually hold any keys. Now this is how you actually enable policy based encryption. Now the other thing which has come in is the vMotion encryption. Now when you're doing a vMotion encryption, we are not encrypting the network itself. There are no certificates or anything of that sort. The encryption happens per VM level, and so once you actually enable encryption, a randomly generated one-time 265-bit key is generated by vCenter, and a 64-bit nonce key or a random key is actually generated once. So once the vMotion is initiated, both the host actually has set the 256-bit key as well as the 64-bit key, and that actually ensures that the VM communication cannot be captured and used to replay the data which has been sent across. So vMotion encryption can be set on unencrypted VMs as well, and is always enabled by default on encrypted VMs. Now coming to secure boot. So secure boot actually works on this principle. If you look at the stack that VMware currently has, you have hardware, UEFI firmware, boot loading components, VM kernel, secure boot verifier, and ESXi, which actually loads up. Now essentially, with this release, VMware has support for both virtual machines and for the ESXi hypervisor boot. So UEFI firmware validates the digital signature of the ESXi kernel against a digital certificate in the UEFI firmware, and only signed kernel drivers would actually boot. Now essentially, if secure boot is enabled, you'll not be able to forcibly install unsigned code on either the ESXi component or the virtual machines that you enable for encryption. Now this is how you actually go ahead and enable secure boot for the virtual machine. The first thing you need to note is it has to be EFI firmware it's actually running on, and then you have an option below there as a checkbox to enable secure boot. So the point to note again is if you enable secure boot for a virtual machine, you can only load signed drivers into that particular virtual machine. Now this can work with both Windows as well as Linux, and so essentially it is OS agnostic. Now this is one of the neatest features which has come in, which actually is enhanced logging. So traditionally ESXi logs or the virtual center logs were based more from a troubleshooting perspective, but here what you're getting is actionable data. So what that means is if somebody goes ahead and makes a change, it'll tell you what change, what it changed from, and what it changed 2. So essentially it's going to give you the pre-changes as well as the post-changes in the logs. So that's one step ahead when you're trying to figure out as to exactly what has changed in the environment. So an example is right here, whether if the vSwitch changed from a PCI to non-PCI, that is what you'll be seeing. Now, due to the enhanced actionable login, VMware Insight Manager is going to have a lot of changes. So actionable items you'll be seeing more in terms of VirtualCenter or Log Insight. So that brings us to an end of what is new, and stay tuned for more videos in which I'll be doing a demo of all the features that we've discussed today.